When you think about some of the most influential people in history, their message is usually pretty clear. But with Jesus, it's a bit different. His teaching methods were often, well, intentionally puzzling. So today, we're going to explore this style of communication that wasn't just about informing people, but about making them think. So, here's the central puzzle we're looking at. Jesus was known as this master communicator, right? But his words often left people scratching their heads, even his closest friends and followers. They were constantly taking his metaphors literally, completely missing the point of his stories, and asking him to explain things over and over. So you have to wonder, was this a flaw in his teaching, or was it all part of a much bigger plan? To really get a grip on his approach, we first have to see that Jesus didn't just have one way of doing things. His teaching generally fell into two really distinct categories. Think of it as a toolkit he used for different crowds and for different reasons. On the one hand, you've got what we can call plain teaching. This was super direct, clear, and right to the point, straightforward commands and big statements about what's true. But on the other hand, and honestly way more often, he used figurative teaching. This meant stories, symbols, and metaphors that really required you, the listener, to do some work and figure them out. Okay, this right here, this is a perfect example of his plain, direct style. There's really no gray area. He's making a clear, bold, and totally straightforward claim about who he is and what he's about. And these moments of pure clarity were absolutely crucial, especially when he was talking privately with his disciples. But then you get something like this. This is the start of that famous parable of the sower. And it's a completely different feel. It's a story. It's a picture painted with words. It doesn't just hand you the answer. Nope. It invites you to come in, to slow down a little, picture the scene, and ask yourself, okay, what does this actually mean for me? So you have these two styles. Which one did he use more? And maybe more importantly, why? Well, when you look at the accounts of his public teaching, a really clear pattern starts to show up. Get this. About 35% of all of Jesus's recorded teachings in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are in the form of parables. So this wasn't just some clever trick he used every now and then. It was his signature method, his go-to strategy, especially when he was speaking to big crowds. And this is where his strategy gets really brilliant. He would often tell these complex, thought-provoking stories to the masses, but then he'd wait to unpack the deeper meaning with just his disciples, in private. This created two different levels of engagement, you see. One for the crowds who were maybe just casually curious, and a much deeper one for his committed followers, the ones willing to stick around and ask for the real explanation. So this brings us right to the heart of it all. Why? Why teach in a way that you know is going to be confusing for a lot of people? Why not just be direct all the time? Well, the answer shows a strategy that is incredibly sophisticated and totally intentional. It really seems to come down to a four-part strategy. First, his stories worked like a filter. For people who were genuinely searching, the parables were like windows they could look through. But for those whose hearts were already closed off, they were like walls. Second, these stories challenged the status quo. They forced people to question the comfortable traditions they had held their entire lives. Third, they separated the committed from the curious. The people who stayed behind to ask, hey, what did you mean by that? Those were the ones who were truly invested. And finally, stories just make truth unforgettable. Our brains are wired for stories. A good one sticks with you in a way that a dry fact just never will. Just think for a second about how radical this must have sounded back then. Using this one simple phrase, Jesus took on centuries of religious tradition. He took these accepted ideas about everything, anger, lust, how to treat your enemies, and he completely turned them upside down. He wasn't just giving them new information, he was forcing his audience to completely rethink the very foundations of their world. And what all this really points to is a bigger, more profound truth. Active, hard thinking isn't the enemy of faith. In fact, it's an absolutely essential part of it. It's just human nature, right? We often prefer someone to just give us the answer, to hand us our beliefs in a nice, neat little package. It's just easier. It takes less work. But Jesus's method is the complete opposite of that. He refused to spoon-feed people answers because he knew that the truth that really changes you is the truth you find for yourself, the kind you have to wrestle with to understand. So let's look at a classic example of this in action. A religious lawyer, an expert in all the rules, comes up to test him with this question. He's probably expecting some kind of technical, legalistic definition he can argue about. But Jesus doesn't bite.
he doesn't give him a definition at all. Instead, he tells a story, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And when the story's over, he flips the question right back on the lawyer. So, which one of these guys do you think was a neighbor? He forces the lawyer and all of us listening in to arrive at the answer on our own. He totally shifts the question from who am I required to love to what does it look like for me to be a loving person?
And look, this idea of using your mind, it's not some one-off thing. It's woven all through the scriptures. Jesus tells his followers to love God with their entire being, and he specifically includes the mind. The Apostle Paul writes to test all things. The Bereans are called noble because they actually fact-checked what Paul was teaching. And way back in the Old Testament, God himself invites people to come and reason with him. This shows that faith isn't meant to be a blind leap. It's a thoughtful, engaged trust.
So, in the end, this teaching method wasn't really about being confusing at all. It was actually an invitation.
You see, his goal was never for people to just passively listen to him talk. It was all about deep, active, and transformative engagement. He wanted to wake people up, to provoke them out of their spiritual and mental laziness, and to build followers whose faith was their own, something they personally understood and were invested in.
He said this phrase all the time, and it's such a powerful reminder that really hearing something isn't just a physical act. It takes an open heart, it takes a curious spirit, and it absolutely takes an engaged mind, a real willingness to listen for the meaning that's just below the surface.
And that really leaves us with a question for ourselves, doesn't it? In our world of instant answers, hot takes, and simple explanations, the method of Jesus is a real challenge. It asks us if we're willing to sit with the questions, to wrestle with the stories, and to do the hard, but incredibly rewarding, work of personal discovery. Because according to his way of teaching, that's exactly where true understanding begins.